Darren Cole never set out to become the most hated man in his town, but one drunken night of stupidity turned him into the face of a hate crime he didn't even understand. What began as a reckless prank with a spray can spiraled into outrage, a manhunt, and a trial that shocked the community. His name would forever be tied not to malice or ideology, but to ignorance so careless it destroyed lives and left a permanent scar on his own. Darren Cole's name was known around his small town, but not for anything admirable. He was the type of man people described as harmless but dim-witted, the sort who stumbled into trouble without ever meaning to. At 28, he still lived with his mother, worked odd shifts that never lasted long, and spent most of his evenings drinking with whoever was willing to put up with him. On one hot summer night, after far too many cheap beers, Darren wandered away from his friends, stumbling into a neighborhood that wasn't his own. The streets were quieter there, lined with family-owned shops and colorful murals celebrating the community's heritage. To Darren, in his half-drunken haze, the walls looked like blank canvases begging to be marked. He dug into his backpack and pulled out a spray can he had stolen earlier in the week, convinced that painting something outrageous would make him the center of attention among his friends. The problem was Darren didn't know what he was copying. A few days earlier, he had seen strange symbols online that caught his eye, thinking they looked edgy and rebellious. He saved a picture on his phone, not realizing they were hate symbols tied to violent extremist groups. Now, swaying on his feet in the dim glow of a streetlight, Darren sprayed those shapes and letters across the wall of a grocery store beloved by the neighborhood. To make it worse, he scrawled his first name inside the graffiti as if leaving a drunken autograph. By the time he staggered off into the night, giggling at his own art, the store's once proud mural had been scarred with a hateful message that looked deliberate, targeted, and cruel. The following morning, sunlight revealed the damage. Shopkeepers arrived to open their businesses and froze in horror at the sight. Within minutes, phones came out, pictures were snapped, and the images spread across social media. What Darren had done wasn't seen as a prank, it was interpreted as an attack. Residents were outraged, shocked that such hatred had been brought into their safe, close-knit community. Activists and community leaders quickly mobilized, calling for justice. Local news picked up the story before noon, broadcasting photos of the vandalism and describing it as a hate crime investigation. Darren, meanwhile, slept late into the day, oblivious to the storm he had unleashed. To him, it was just another night of mischief. To everyone else, it was a threat that demanded answers. He had no idea that his reckless decision would make him the most hated man in town by sundown. By the time Darren finally rolled out of bed late in the afternoon, the entire town was already buzzing about the graffiti. Neighbors were angry, the police were investigating, and the photos of his sloppy work had been shared thousands of times online. To anyone who saw it, the crude symbols screamed of hate and intimidation. It didn't matter that Darren had no real idea what they meant. To the public, it was deliberate. Reporters were already calling it one of the worst acts of vandalism the neighborhood had seen in years. The grocery store he had chosen wasn't just any shop, it was a gathering place, a cornerstone of the community, owned by a family that had lived there for generations. The impact of his drunken prank cut deeper than he could have ever imagined. Darren, however, had no awareness of the chaos he'd caused. When he scrolled through his phone and saw the photos circulating, he laughed at first, proud that his handiwork was getting attention. He even bragged to a few acquaintances online, typing clumsy messages about how sick the graffiti looked. What he didn't realize was that investigators were already examining the scene carefully. They had found an empty beer can near the wall, still carrying his fingerprints. Even worse, his own sloppy decision to sign his name inside the graffiti left detectives with a glaring clue. Darren might have thought he was clever, but to the police it looked like arrogance, a criminal flaunting his work. By evening, community leaders were holding a meeting about the crime. They urged residents to remain calm but demanded swift justice. The police announced they were searching for the suspect and promised charges. Tip lines were opened, and within hours, calls started flooding in. A few of Darren's so-called friends, who had heard him brag, wasted no time pointing the finger at him. Social media pages dedicated to neighborhood safety began posting his name and picture, warning everyone to keep an eye out. Darren was now a target, though he had no idea just how serious the situation was becoming. What had started as a drunken act of stupidity was quickly snowballing into something much larger. Darren thought he was getting attention for a harmless stunt, but to law enforcement and the people of the town, he was a criminal who had painted hatred on their walls. His carelessness had opened the door to consequences far beyond a simple charge of vandalism. For Darren, the real trouble was only beginning. When the police finally came knocking on Darren's door, he was too hungover to think straight. Instead of answering calmly and trying to explain, he peered through the blinds, saw the uniforms, and made the worst decision of his life. He bolted out the back door with a half-packed backpack, convinced that running would solve his problems. That one reckless move transformed the investigation into a manhunt. What could have been an arrest for vandalism escalated into a citywide search for a suspect now labeled dangerous and hateful. Darren didn't grasp it, but every step he took made him look more guilty than ever. He spent the first night hiding behind dumpsters and in parking lots, trying to keep his head down. The following day, he slipped into an abandoned building, surviving on vending machine snacks he had stolen. Still, he couldn't resist checking his phone. What he saw shocked even him. His face was plastered across news reports, described as the suspect behind a hate crime that had rattled the community. Commentators spoke about him as though he were a violent extremist, a man driven by ideology, rather than what he really was, a fool who didn't know what the symbols meant. But Darren didn't realize that explaining his ignorance now wouldn't matter. The damage was already done. On the third day, his paranoia grew. He avoided calling anyone, though part of him craved attention. Hunger pushed him into a mistake that sealed his fate. With only a few crumpled bills left, he used his debit card at a gas station to buy chips and an energy drink. Within minutes, investigators had tracked the transaction, confirming his location. Patrol cars swept through the area as helicopters circled above. Darren, meanwhile, had no idea he had given himself away. He still believed he was outsmarting everyone. As the manhunt expanded, so did the outrage. Locals feared more attacks and demanded authorities catch him before things escalated. News outlets framed him as a symbol of growing hate in small towns, giving his actions far more weight than he had ever intended. Darren wasn't running from ideology. He was running from stupidity. Yet every headline, every broadcast, painted him as someone far more sinister. His attempt to escape responsibility was only making him infamous, dragging him deeper into a nightmare of his own making. The town was no longer just looking for answers, they were hunting for justice. Darren's time on the run came to an end after nearly a week of chaos. Exhausted, filthy, and increasingly paranoid, he had taken shelter near a construction site on the edge of town. Workers arriving early one morning spotted him crouched behind equipment, muttering to himself while clutching his backpack. Within minutes, the police were called, and squad cars swarmed the site. Darren tried to dart through the half-built structure, but there was nowhere to go. Officers closed in from every side, and bystanders gathered quickly, some recording the arrest on their phones. The crowd wasn't just curious, they were furious. Shouts erupted as Darren was handcuffed and dragged out, his face pale and bewildered under the weight of the attention. He looked nothing like the dangerous figure the news had painted him to be, but appearances no longer mattered. To the public, this was the man who had attacked their community. At the station, Darren's real level of ignorance was revealed. Under questioning, it became clear he had no ties to extremist groups, no record of political involvement, and no grasp of what the symbols he painted meant. He admitted he had copied them from the internet without understanding their history, but investigators knew intent and impact were two different things. Whether Darren understood the meaning or not, he had defaced a cherished business with hateful imagery that made families feel threatened. His choice to flee and hide only convinced many that he knew exactly what he was doing. The case moved quickly toward trial, fueled by public outrage and constant media coverage. Commentators debated whether stupidity should carry the same weight as deliberate malice, but the community wanted accountability. Prosecutors argued that his recklessness created real harm and should be punished just as harshly as intentional hate. His defense team tried to frame him as a drunk fool, too unintelligent to understand the seriousness of his actions. Yet the evidence, the beer can with his fingerprints, the signed name on the wall, his flight from police all worked against him. By the time jury selection began, Darren had become infamous. Tabloids mocked him as the idiot hate criminal, while nightly news programs turned his trial into a spectacle. He was no longer simply Darren Cole, the small-town screw-up. He had become a cautionary symbol. proof that ignorance did not shield anyone from the consequences of their actions. And as the trial unfolded, it became clear that the law was determined to make an example of him. The courtroom was packed on the day Darren's sentence was handed down. Journalists filled the front rows, cameras flashed outside, and members of the community sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting to hear the outcome of the case that had gripped the town. Darren stood before the judge in a wrinkled shirt, his face pale and drawn from weeks of confinement. He looked less like a criminal mastermind and more like a confused child who had wandered into trouble for bigger than himself. But appearances didn't matter anymore. The evidence was undeniable, the harm was real, and the public wanted closure. The judge spoke firmly, reminding everyone that while Darren may not have understood the full meaning of his actions, ignorance did not erase the pain caused. What had begun as drunken recklessness had spread fear and division, and that demanded accountability. The sentence was harsh, heavier than what Darren had imagined possible. He received several years in prison. Along with mandatory educational programs on hate crimes and their impacts, the judge made it clear Darren's case would stand as a warning that carelessness carried consequences, and society would not excuse actions that tore at the fabric of community trust. As the verdict was read, murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. For the victims, justice felt served. For Darren, the weight of his stupidity finally sank in. The smirk he once wore when bragging about his graffiti was gone, replaced by the realization that his entire life had been derailed by one foolish night. Behind bars, Darren's story followed him. Other inmates mocked him not as a hardened criminal, but as the man who had accidentally committed a hate crime. News outlets continued to revisit his case, especially when discussions about vandalism, hate speech, or community safety arose. His name became shorthand for reckless ignorance. Instead of notoriety for rebellion, he was remembered as the fool whose mistakes changed lives. Meanwhile, the grocery store wall he had defaced was transformed. Local artists came together to paint a new mural, one filled with bright colors, symbols of unity, and messages of resilience. What Darren had destroyed was rebuilt stronger, turning his act of destruction into a spark for solidarity. In the end, his crime became less about hate and more about how a community could rise above ignorance. Darren Cole would serve his time, but his story would remain a lasting reminder that stupidity can be just as destructive as malice, and sometimes the consequences are far greater than anyone expects.